The horse screamed before Sadi ever saw it, a sound sharp and terrified, tearing through a storm that had already swallowed the road, the fence line, every familiar shape of her father's ranch. No rider with sense would be out in weather like this. She went anyway. Late November 1881, Judith Basin, Montana. Sarah Sadie Harland was 29 and alone at Harland Ranch. Her father Wesley had died in September, and she'd left his coat on its peg, his mug on the shelf, his auger on the bench, his chair angled toward the stove, exactly as he'd left them, as if some part of her still expected him to walk back through that door before supper. The cattle huddled behind the barn wall. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was being flattened and swept across the ground by wind ripping off the northwest ridge. Sadie had already tightened the shutters, twisted wool into the cold gap along the sill, banked the stove. The springboks had been slowing for days, and the cattle still needed water. She was turning back toward the cabin after checking the trough when the horse cried out again beyond the fence. She took the lantern from its hook, looped a rope over one shoulder, and pushed back into the storm. The mare stood beyond the cottonwood fence, reins dragging through the snow, pressed against the rails. She could have run. She hadn't. A man hung sideways from the saddle, one boot trapped in the stirrup, his left shoulder sagging at a bad angle, blood dried black along one trouser leg. Sadie touched his neck. A pulse answered, weak but steady. She couldn't carry him. She tied the rope around his chest, passed it over the saddle horn, took some of his weight, freed the trapped boot. He slid down slowly instead of falling. She spread an empty feed sack over folded canvas, rolled him onto the porch, dragging him toward the porch, the mare following as far as the gate. Inside, firelight reached across the doorway. Fresh blood had soaked through his trouser leg. The cold was no longer the greatest danger. Sadie cut the frozen cloth away from his thigh. The wound was deep, but the blood didn't pulse. That gave her time. She boiled water, let it cool, washed away the dirt and dried blood without digging into the torn flesh. Clean cloth over the wound, pressed until the bleeding slowed, tied firmly in place. His shoulder worried her next. It sat wrong, and forcing it back might do more harm than leaving it. She folded a strip of wool into a sling and bound his arm against his body. She wrapped heated stones in cloth, set them near his chest and sides. When he stirred enough to swallow, she gave him warm broth, a little at a time. Only then did she pull her coat back on. The mare was waiting in the barn. Sadie removed the saddle, ran her hands down its legs, found no serious injury, pushed hay into the manger. Before dawn, the stranger opened his eyes. He saw the barn shape through the window. His face loosened. He breathed out and closed his eyes again. Sadie stayed beside him until his breathing settled. Then she looked across the stove. Wesley's chair stood empty, turned toward the door, exactly where she'd left it after the funeral. For the first time since September, another man was sleeping under her father's roof. If a story like this one, where quiet endurance finally gets what it's owed, is the kind that stays with you, I'd love it if you'd tap that like button before we go further, and subscribe if you'd like more stories like this one finding their way to you. Now back to the story. The storm held for 3 days. By the second morning, the stranger could stay awake long enough to speak. His name was Elias Boon, 34. A horse buyer and breaker who'd spent years moving between ranches, freight camps, and stockyards. He offered little more unless Sadie asked. She answered the same way. Elias didn't need many questions to understand the cabin. One plate remained apart from the others. Wesley's saddle gathered dust in the barn. The ranch ledger stopped for several days after September. When Sadie opened it to count winter expenses, he caught one figure before she closed the book: $3,160. The haystack told him the rest. He'd also noticed the loose brace on the north barn wall, the cold slipping through the northwest sill, the broken latch on the feed chest. His left arm was useless, but his right still worked. He found a scrap of hardwood and carved a new catch with Sadi's knife. When he reached towards Wesley's auger on the bench, his hand stopped. "May I?" Sadi looked at the tool, then at him. She nodded. That evening she served supper without mentioning the repair. Elias found more broth in his bowl than he had the night before. He noticed that too. Outside, the wind kept pressing at the walls. Inside, neither of them found much reason to fill the silence. The basin stayed closed beneath snow, and Elias recovered by the grease. His shoulder still wouldn't bear weight, so he worked around it, replacing the bent lantern hook near the door, shaving the cracked edge off of Sadi's axe handle, whittling a wooden peg for a loose harness strap, adjusting the door latch until it caught without being lifted. Sadi spent those hours mending tack and dividing the remaining hay by animal and week. They rarely spoke unless the work required it. At night, they sat on opposite sides of the stove. One evening, Elias looked through the window towards the barn. "Why does it sit crooked to the cabin?" "It isn't crooked." Sadi set down the strap she was stitching. "Wesley followed the slope when he built it. The northwest ridge complicates everything. Wind might seem to come straight across the basin, but snow shows where the air slows, curls, drops what it's carrying." She pointed toward a pale ridge forming beyond the corral. "Snow tells more truth than wind does." Elias said nothing. He rose, crossed to the window, watched the drifting line, studied where snow gathered behind the fence and where ground stayed bare. Then he returned to his chair and picked up the wood he'd been shaping. Sadi went back to her stitching. The stove settled between them. The silence inside the cabin didn't feel like something that needed fixing. On the fourth morning, the wind dropped. Blue showed between broken clouds. Elias tested his shoulder before breakfast. It still hurt, but he could hold the reins. "The pass may look open before it is," Sadi said. "I know." He had horses promised along the Fort Benton route. A buyer was waiting, and waiting men eventually bought elsewhere. Sadi understood that kind of obligation. She didn't ask him to stay. Elias saddled the mare slowly, mostly with his right hand. Before mounting, he crossed to the barn and drove a second spike beside the loose north brace. "It'll hold for now. That brace needs more than one nail." "I know." There was nothing else to settle. He mounted. The mare stepped through the gate and turned toward the basin road. Sadi stood in the doorway until horse and rider became a dark shape against the snow. He never looked back. She went inside before the shape disappeared. Later, checking the barn, she found the hammer he'd used, returned to the exact spot beside the auger where Wesley always kept it. Sadi stood there a moment. Then she picked it up and moved it to the other end of the bench. The ranch went quiet again. Nothing important had changed. Cattle to feed, ice to break, wood to cut, fences buried beneath snow, and yet Elias had left small changes behind him. The lantern stayed straight on its new hook. The axe handle no longer rubbed Sadi's palm raw. The feed chest closed with one push. A harness strap that used to fall behind the bench now hung from a wooden peg. Each repair saved only seconds. Together, they made his absence harder to ignore. One evening, lifting the stew pot, Sadi filled a bowl without thinking. She reached for another, filled that one too. Her hand stopped. Steam rose between the two bowls while the fire cracked behind her. She poured the second serving back into the pot, washed the bowl, dried it, placed it on the shelf above the others. Morning came cold. Work answered it. Ice from the trough, the thin flow from the spring box. The haystack measured again, the ration reduced slightly. Deadfall down from the cottonwoods by rope, pregnant cows checked twice a day. Every new drift near the barn approach cut down before the wind packed it hard. Her gloves split at the fingers. The north brace creaked whenever the wind strengthened. Winter had no interest in who had stayed or who had gone. January was hard. February was worse. Cold settled over Black Alder Creek and stayed there. One calf went down, trembling, and Sadi moved it to the corner with the least draft, spread dry hay beneath it, covered its back with an old wool blanket. That night, the north wall groaned. The brace Elias had warned about had loosened again. She cut a cottonwood pole, set it diagonally against the frame, drove an iron spike home. Rough work. It only had to hold. After midnight, the wind shifted, cutting cold across the calf's corner. She hung a reed mat between two posts, blocking the low draft while leaving an opening above. The barn still needed to breathe. She checked the calf twice before dawn. At sunrise, it pushed its front legs beneath itself, then stood, then reached its mother. There was still ice to break. By the end of March, winter began releasing the lower meadow. Sadi found the first prairie crocus opening on a sunny bank, cut several stems, carried them home in one hand. Inside, she opened the east window a few inches, cool air moving through without winter's hard bite. She filled a small jar with water and set the flowers inside, moving aside the one clean bowl that had sat alone on the upper shelf since November and setting the jar in its place where morning light could reach it. By early April, the basin road began showing through the last dirty snowbanks. Sadi sat outside the barn with a breast strap across her knees, working an owl through stiff leather. Black Alder Creek rushed louder behind the cottonwoods. Then came hoofbeats. One horse, a neighbor passing through maybe, then a second rhythm, a third, slower, under a load. Sadi stopped the owl halfway through the leather. The first shape on the basin road was the mare, the same one that had carried Elias here half-frozen and bleeding in November. This time, he rode tall in the saddle, leaner than he'd been, his face darkened by months of sun and wind, his left shoulder moving freely now. Behind him came a stout dun mare, then a pack horse loaded with canvas rolls and bundled supplies. Elias reached the gate and stopped outside it. He didn't open it himself. Sadi rose, still holding the owl. For several seconds, neither spoke. "The road opened yesterday. You rode fast." He didn't answer. Sadi looked past him, heavy canvas tied behind the pack saddle, iron strap, an auger bit, a crosscut saw, sacks of salt and coffee, a smaller bag of seed grain. Then she studied the dun mare. Broad chest, strong legs, calm eyes, a working animal, chosen carefully. "Whose mare?" "Yours, if you'll have her." Sadi looked at the animal, then back at him. "No." He waited. "I can't pay for her." "I'm not selling her." "That makes it worse." Elias said nothing. Sadi lowered the owl to her side. "I don't take charity." His eyes moved across the ranch, the new diagonal brace on the north wall, fresh earth over part of the water line, fence reels reset along the meadow. The place was worn, but it hadn't been waiting for him. "You kept me alive. I remembered what needed doing. The debt was paid when you rode alive out." That stopped him. Wind moved lightly through the cottonwoods. The mare lowered her head beside the gate. "All right." He looked toward the canvas and tools, then at the dun mare. "I need board for a few weeks. She can cover part of it. Supplies cover the rest. I work while I'm here, for wages, for meals, and a place to sleep." Sadi studied him long enough that the dun mare shifted one hind foot. This was different. Not rescue, not repayment. Work could be measured, so could feed, lodging, tools, horseflesh. "And when the work is even, then you tell me?" She looked at the barn, the sagging gate, the willow stakes beside the wet ground. There was more work than either of them could finish quickly. She walked to the gate and lifted the wooden latch, pulling it inward. Only then did the mare step onto Harland Ranch. They began with the work closest at hand, the north barn brace, then the sagging gate, the creek crossing, a broken fence section along the lower meadow. None of it changed the ranch at once. Each repair simply removed one problem from tomorrow. Working near the barn, Elias began studying the northwest side. The ridge sent winter wind almost straight toward the livestock wall. He proposed a windbreak, 27 feet out, cottonwood poles woven tightly with willow. Sadi looked toward the ridge. Too tight. It's far enough from the barn. The snow won't care. He rested his hand on a post. She didn't argue further. We'll see after the next snow. So they built the first section his way. Days found a rhythm. Sadi rode the meadow and checked cattle while Elias split poles. They repaired fence together in the afternoon. At dusk, tools cleaned and returned to the bench. Some evenings they sat near the stove, some on the porch. Elias spoke about freight roads, stockyards, bad horses, camps that disappeared when the work moved on. Sadi told him where Black Alder Creek flooded, which slopes dried first, where winter wind left bare ground beneath deep snow. 1 week became 2. Neither mentioned the agreement. Each night Elias rolled his bed beside the same cabin wall. His spare clothes stayed inside the pack. His bedroll always returned to the same corner, but he never unpacked it completely. Sadi noticed. She never asked why. The answer came before April was finished, in a late snow that crossed the basin after dark. Not dangerous, only a few inches, but enough. Elias stepped outside and stopped. The windbreak had broken the direct wind exactly as he'd expected. But along its edge, the air had curled hard around the tight willow weave, and a thick drift curved toward the gate. Sadi walked past him carrying willow stakes, pushed one into the highest part of the drift, another where the snow began to thin. She said nothing. Elias walked the full length of the barrier, studied the bare ground on the windward side, the heavy deposit behind it, the curved ridge reaching toward the gate. Then he fetched his tools and began removing willow. Together, they opened gaps through the woven sections, changed the angle of the outer end, extended it farther from the barn while keeping the main barrier about 27 feet away. "You're not trying to stop it," he said. Sadi looked toward the ridge. Wind doesn't stop. She pointed at the open ground between the barrier and the barn. "You make it spend itself before it gets there." Elias looked again at the drift his tighter wall had made. Snow had settled the argument overnight. He picked up the hammer, then instead of driving the next post himself, held it out to her. Sadi took it. He moved aside while she marked where the next post would go. The spring thaw exposed another problem. During February's worst cold, Sadi had piled extra earth over a low section of the wooden water conduit to keep the flow from freezing. Now that ground stayed wet. Runoff collected beside the trench and soaked into the packed bedding, and one edge began to slump. Sadi studied it, shovel in hand. "It needs to go deeper." Elias crouched beside the trench, followed the grade with his eyes. Depth isn't the problem. He pushed the shovel into the wet earth. Water gathered immediately. It has nowhere to drain. They cut a shallow bypass channel for runoff, laid coarse gravel beneath the low section, raised the wooden box slightly to restore an even fall, fitted a removable lid at the access point so the channel could be cleared without digging it open again. Sadi worked without complaint, though every shovel of earth removed work she'd done only weeks earlier. By afternoon, water drained away from the conduit instead of collecting around it. "I hated doing that twice," she said. Elias tamped gravel beside the box. "Better April than January." Sadi tried to hold her expression. She failed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. Through May and June, the separate repairs began working as one system. The windbreak grew along the northwest side. Split willow held open enough for air to pass through, standing away from the building where moving air could lose force before reaching the livestock. Inside, reed mats and bunch grass formed a second inner skin against low drafts in the calf corner. The upper section left open so damp air could escape. The water line got straw and reed insulation, earth cover, drainage beneath its lowest section, removable access points. Harland Ranch still looked worn, it no longer looked neglected. One afternoon, Caleb Dern rode in from his place 8 miles away, an older rancher who trusted what had worked before. He stopped beside the windbreak, studied the gaps between the willow strips, and laughed outright. "You left half the wind in it." Sadi leaned against a post. "That's the half we wanted." Caleb shook his head and rode on. Elias watched him disappear toward the creek. "You want me to close it tighter so people quit talking?" Sadi looked at the open weave, then the bare ground between barrier and barn. No. There was nothing more to discuss. Caleb had his opinion. The windbreak hadn't yet seen a Montana winter. When it did, opinion would matter very little. By late June, people in the settlement knew Elias had stayed longer than a few weeks. Lenora Pike, a prominent figure in the local women's church circle, found Sadi outside the general store and spoke quietly. A woman alone could lose a good name faster than she could earn it back. A man sleeping under the same roof gave people something to discuss. Sadi let her finish, then went inside. Orville Beck, the storekeeper, had carried the Harland account through lean months before expecting payment after cattle sales. This time, he pushed the ledger across the counter. "I'll need this settled sooner." He didn't offer an insult. He didn't mention Elias. He didn't have to. Warren Pell arrived while Sadi was checking the figures, a cattle buyer who'd heard enough to believe she needed money. He offered a low price for several head. Sadi refused. He raised it slightly. Sadi refused again. Elias stood near the supply sacks, close enough to hear every word. He stayed there. Pell glanced toward him. "You may not have much choice by fall." Sadie closed the ledger. "We'll see about fall." She paid for salt and left the rest. On the ride home, Elias kept his horse beside hers. For several miles, neither spoke. Finally, he looked at her. "You want me gone?" Sadie kept her eyes on the road. She didn't answer. That afternoon, on the porch, she told him what Lenora had said, about Beck shortening the account, about Pell trying to use the rumor against her. Elias listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked across the yard. "I can leave. If me being here cost you business, I can move on tomorrow." The words settled between them. Sadie looked toward the barn, the repaired north wall standing firm, the willow windbreak crossing the yard with daylight showing through its gaps, the dun mare grazing near the corral, Black Alder Creek catching the last light beyond it. All winter she'd kept the ranch alive alone. She knew she could do it again. That wasn't the question anymore. "No." She turned toward him. "I don't want you gone." Elias didn't reach for her. He didn't ask what she meant beyond the words she'd given him. He only nodded. The fall gather came in heavier than either of them expected. The dun mare worked the herd without fighting the reins, exactly as Elias had promised she would, and by the time the cattle reached the rail siding, Sadie had counted enough head to cover Beck's ledger twice over. She paid it in full at the counter, in cash, and didn't explain herself. Beck counted the bills, wrote the balance clear, and said only, "Appreciate it, Mrs." He stopped himself. "Miss Harland." Warren Pell found her outside the stockyard gate a week later and named a price for the calves she still had left to sell. It was fair this time, not the lowball figure he'd tried in June. Sadie looked at the number a long moment. "Fair price, same as anybody's." Pell nodded once and didn't push further. He never came around asking again. By late November, nearly a year had passed since the mare first carried Elias Boon through the storm. The warning came before the snow. The horses restless, the wind shifting north and staying there, thin ice along Black Alder Creek thickening between morning and noon. By afternoon, the upper ridge disappeared behind a gray wall. Sadie and Elias worked fast, tightened the willow lashings, cleared both access points on the water conduit, moved the 2 weaker calves behind the reed barrier, stretched a rope between the cabin and the barn. Then the blizzard struck. A willow section snapped. Elias reached for his coat. "I'll replace it." Sadie caught his arm. "Leave it. The rest is wilding." Water couldn't wait. They followed the rope to the conduit. One access lid frozen shut. Elias drove a hatchet edge beneath it while Sadie cleared packed snow from the outlet. The lid broke free. Water still moved below, thin and slow, but moving. Back at the barn, another gust hit and the wall groaned. The calves stayed behind the low reed barrier, protected from the direct draft, damp air escaping above them. Sadi pulled the door open and looked out. Snow had piled deep against the windward side of the willow barrier, but between the windbreak and the barn, the livestock approach stayed passable. The gate stayed clear. The door still opened. One panel broken, one access lid frozen. Nothing had worked perfectly. It didn't need to. What Caleb Dern called half a wall was doing exactly what Sadi intended. The wind hadn't been stopped. It had spent itself somewhere else. The storm went into the night. Then something struck the outer gate. Elias lifted the lantern. Sadi took the rope. They followed the line through blowing snow until a horse appeared beyond the gate. Head low, sides heaving. Caleb Dern leading it. His wife Naomi sagging in the saddle beneath a snow-covered coat. Sadi opened the gate. No time for questions. They brought Naomi inside, wrapped her in dry wool, gave her warm broth. Caleb stayed near the stove only long enough to feel his hands again. His own solid plank wind wall had stopped the wind, and stopped the snow too, a deep drift forming close behind it, burying much of his barn approach and nearly cutting his cattle off from water. He hadn't lost his herd, but he could no longer keep the access open alone. By morning, the storm weakened. Caleb walked outside with Elias and Sadi and saw where snow had collected beyond the Harland windbreak, instead of against the barn, a clear livestock approach. Inside, the calf section stayed dry enough to bed animals while moisture escaped through the opening above. At the conduit, Elias lifted the access cover. Water still trickled through. Caleb said nothing. He walked to the windbreak, then began counting his steps toward the barn. When he reached the wall, he turned. 27 feet. Sadi looked across the yard. Near enough. Caleb walked back, put one hand against the split willow, looked through the openings he'd laughed at months earlier. Beyond them lay the heavy drift. Behind him stood an open barn door. He ran his fingers along one of the gaps. No apology followed. None was needed. When a practical man starts asking for measurements, the argument is already over. Winter didn't end with the storm. A fence section still needed repair. Hay remained tight. The stove consumed wood daily, and someone checked the water access every morning. Harland Ranch had survived. It hadn't become easy. Before the ground froze solid, Elias hauled in a small wagon of lumber, stacked the boards beside the cabin, covered them with canvas. One morning, he stood at the east wall, studying the ground beneath the window. When it thaws, I could set a sill here. Sadi looked outside. A room? He paused. If I build it, I'd rather build it as your husband than your hired hand. There was no kneeling, no speech prepared for the moment. Sadi studied the east ground where morning sunlight reached first. Square the foundation before you start. That evening, she took down her father's mug from the shelf, the one that sat untouched since September, the one she'd left exactly where Wesley set it down. She washed it, dried it, and set it on the table beside her own. She didn't explain why. Elias didn't ask. He simply reached for it the next morning when he poured the coffee, the way a man reaches for a thing that has always belonged where it's sitting. They married quietly. Reverend Asa Whitcomb performed the ceremony. Caleb and Naomi Dern stood as witnesses. Winter remained outside. Weeks later, another storm crossed the basin. Sadi banked the stove before bed, checked the shutter, ran her fingers along the northwest sill for cold air. 2 coats hung beside the door now. Elias's gloves dried from a peg beneath the rope. Sadi's hat rested above them. Outside, wind moved through the willow barrier. Water still needed watching. The barn still needed repairs. A year earlier, a horse had carried a dying stranger to that doorway. By spring, he'd ridden back because he chose to. Now winter had returned and judged what they'd built together, and held. Elias crossed the room and nudged a piece of wood closer to the hearth with his boot. Sadi poured coffee into one mug, then another. She placed the second on the table. This time, she didn't put it back. This is where quiet endurance found what it was owed, not a rescue, but a partnership, built one repair at a time. If this story stayed with you, there's more of this basin's history waiting. Tell me, did you see the windbreak vindicated the way you expected, or did winter surprise you too? Let me know where you're watching from. I read every one.